So who are you?
That's a very good question. I sometimes wonder that myself, because I am a complex personality, and I've done many, many things throughout my life in different countries and with different institutions and institutes and such like. And I'm really a creature of great curiosity, and that's not just in the sciences, but that's in the arts as well. And so I'm a real mixture and a muddle of a person in many ways. I have this insatiable curiosity about science. I've had in the past, when I've been a performing musician, an insatiable curiosity about music. And I have, to this day, and continues, and I will probably continue until I fall over, an insatiable curiosity for travel. So I have been all over this planet, to so many different parts of the world.
Out of all the things you've just said, what do you love most?
Oh, goodness. My family, actually. I have a wonderful family in England. I have children and now grandchildren recently, and they are a huge part of my life. I'd love to see them a lot more than I'm capable of doing. And then beyond that, obviously the professional interest is the thing that drives me every day of my life. I do actually enjoy getting out of bed every day and coming to work, because every day is very, very different. And whether it's research, which has been a mainstay of my career for the last 40 years or so, or my current position, leading the American Institute, which is not research, but it's very much underpinning what our research scientists and colleagues throughout the world are doing in the world of physics and the physical sciences. This is still, I'm still the new kid on the block. I'm still very much the newbie in this position, and every day is different. It brings very, very unusual and frankly great challenges. And so piecing all that together and trying to make sense of what we do as an institute in relation to our physicists, physical scientists, researchers and administrators and such like, not only in the United States but around the world, that to me is a tremendous motivation and challenge at this particular moment in time.
So what are your objectives as the fairly new CEO of the American Institute of Physics? How will you make a difference there?
That's the $64,000 question. I was brought on very much, the board, when they interviewed me, said that they were looking for an agent for change. This is a long-established, I think, 85, 86-year-old institute. There hasn't been a huge amount of change in recent decades. We're a federation of member societies, including the American Physical Society, the Optical Society of America, the astronomers, the crystallographers, the sound experts, the lot. We have about 125,000 members through our membership scheme. And the question is, what do we change, and how do we shape an institute so that it really delivers a great value proposition for everybody into the future? And what do we change? We want to be an agent for change. So I really have three platforms which I've initiated since I've been here, very much with the board approval. Clearly one has to have very strong board support and board buy-in to make any significant differences at all. And I've been driving the institute in these three directions. Firstly, to generate more member societies, to be even more inclusive across the physical sciences, so to grow the membership and to supply an ever better value proposition, so that we do for our member societies what they cannot do for themselves. So, for example, media operations, global media operations, is something which no single member society is really large enough to undertake on its own, but as a collective, we can definitely make a very significant impact and raise the visibility and value of the member societies, not only in this country but overseas as well. So that's proposition one. Proposition two is something I've spent a great deal of my life doing, and that is globalizing the American Institute. America, for decades, has been really the rock, the real mountain of physics, the leader of physics in many ways in the world. But, in the last 20, 30 years, we've watched physics and physical sciences gravitate more and more to Asia. And so now you find a huge number of scientists and a vast amount of investment now in China and Singapore and Japan and Korea and Malaysia, and so all places in that direction. So we have to maintain our relevance and our connectedness and our leadership role within physics. We have to be totally integrated as best as we can with our Asian colleagues, as they're in the ascendancy and we're not in the descendancy, but we're certainly flat and declining to some degree. And so I'm trying to take a very long-term vision that we have to be connected as we can with the future of physical sciences and engineering particularly in Asia, which is where the current powerhouse is really developing. And then last but by no means least, I think a focus on these activities which make life for the physical scientist really as good as possible. And so that's where we address the issues of minorities, women, where we address LGBT, where we address the framework within which we as scientists operate, and how can we make that better and better, and particularly the communications aspects globally. So then you look at information that might be translated, for example. If we translated all our material into Mandarin and Spanish, we'd reach another 2/3 of the planet.
You mentioned women a few minutes ago, which leads me on to a question from Vanita Mawaha Madil, who's the founder of Rocket Women. And she's particularly interested in hearing what the American Institute of Physics and you leading the American Institute of Physics are planning to do to encourage more women to study physics and to move into physics as a profession, whether it's research, whether it's leading an institute like yours.
Sure. It's a really great question, and we're very fortunate to have some fabulous women scientists, physicists, physical scientists, and it has been difficult to move the needle to get more and more to come into the profession. But so we work through our member societies. And I would point to the program, the very substantial program from the American Physical Society, which is one of our member societies, where they work hard, a department devoted to developing women, minorities, LGBT, and such like activities. And they have a whole program of activities which draws people in, from particularly outreach activities, which allow us to catch scientists very young and give them the enthusiasm and the opportunity to get involved in what we do every day as a part of our profession. So there's the outreach to try and catch them young. We try and catch them young through the Society of Physics Students, which is an undergraduate body. We have many thousands of students, many hundreds of chapters throughout this country and elsewhere in the world, where we can really raise, again, to our young scientists, the opportunities and down through high schools and such like, the opportunities that physics offers. And we can raise awareness through these organizations of women who've made it, women who are in great leadership roles in the physical sciences today. I mean, today here in the United States, the leader of the National Science Foundation is France Cordova, who's an outstanding scientist in her own right. So this country, the United States NSF, is led by a woman scientist. But then look at the physicists that we have leading our member societies. We have Beth Cunningham, who's a physicist who is the chief executive of the American Association of Physics Teachers. And she has a very aggressive program and is very voluble in trying to move forward the role of women and the opportunities for women in physics and physics teaching. The American Physical Society itself has two women leaders. We have Kate Kirby, who's the chief executive, a terrific role model for women, and we have the incoming new president, Laura Green, who's down in Florida, a great research scientist in her own right. These women are real fantastic role models and examples for women as to what they can achieve. They can go right to the top. There isn't a glass ceiling. These people have made it off their own efforts. And they're bringing a lot of women forward at this time, and they're working very hard individually to try and raise awareness and create opportunity for women. I'll just mention one or two others. Within my own member society cohort here, my colleague Judith Flippen-Anderson was the president of the Crystallographic Association. My colleague Judy Dubno is a past president of the Acoustical Society of America. Who else have we got? We've got Faith Morrison from Michigan, who is a past president of the Society of Rheologists. I've just mentioned to you, half a dozen scientists who are in great leadership roles within this country. And then, for example, at our physics, PhysCon, our huge undergraduate physics convention in the Bay Area in November this year, our lead speaker is Jocelyn Bell Burnell from the United Kingdom, who is herself a tremendous ambassador for women in physics and such an inspiration to everyone who meets her. And we've also had many famous physicists winning prizes from the American Institute and the APS. People like Helen Quinn, who is so big in this country in educational physics and is a tremendous role model for women. So I don't need to go on. I've just mentioned half a dozen outstanding female scientists who are really making a difference in their everyday lives and who work passionately and work very hard towards trying to create the awareness that physics is a great profession for women to be in. They have a lot to offer, and they really can achieve the very highest heights.
You've been a professor for over 20 years of your working life for two different universities, Queen's University, I believe, in Belfast, and the Beckman Institute in California. Could you, I presume that you have been researching for your own initiatives within those universities. Could you tell us a little bit about your research and your specific interests?
Yes, of course. I've always been fascinated by optics and light, right from the age of 3. My very first book was a Ladybird book called Light, Mirrors and Lenses, and I think I'm going to blame the rest of my life on that book. I from a very early age, and seriously very early, I've always been fascinated by light and colour and anything to do with lenses and images and such like. And so my research, my undergraduate studies were at Royal Holloway College in London, with the director there was Samuel Zelansky, who was using light techniques to examine moon dust in the late 60s and the early 70s. I found that very inspirational, and that's why I went there. And there were colleagues there who were heavily involved with early days of laser research, of course, late 60s, early 70s. And I found that inspirational too. That really drove me into a lifetime of optic to photonics.
Did you ever have the opportunity of meeting Professor Charles Kao? I understand he was a trailblazer in fibre optics.
Yes, absolutely. I've worked in fibre optics. I never know he was a generation ahead of me, and I'd love to have met him. I've met many of the great optics leaders of our era,
yes,
the more modern era. And indeed, to this day, I still have very strong interests in applied fibre optics, photonics measurements, which we'll come to in a second. But a very quick traverse through this career in optics. I went to the Royal Radar Establishment in Malvern, in England, for 12 or 13 years and specialised in what we call photon correlation techniques, detecting single particles of light, single photons, and looking at their statistical processes so that we could discover what was changing their colour, perhaps velocity of particles moving in fluids, or small Brownian motion of little particles suspended in liquids, so we could get particle size information. So there I'm shining laser beams and measuring light properties from different experiments and learning how to process statistical information about light. That drove me. From there, I'm trying to think of the order of my career, so all of a sudden. But from there, slightly indirectly, I went to Sharp Laboratories in Oxford, which didn't exist when I arrived. I was appointed director of optoelectronics research, head of optoelectronics research, and we created a new research centre, which exists to this day, on the Oxford Science Park, specifically to look at laser diodes for DVD players and Blu-ray, specifically to look at the optics of liquid crystal displays, such as the screens that you and I are using in our laptops at the present time. So we created a research centre there with a lot of female PhD and a lot of female PhD colleagues. It was very aggressive from 1989 to 1998, and so a huge focus there for 10 years on very applied optics and photonics for technologies that you and I now use every day of our lives routinely. A lot of it came out of my colleagues' work in Oxford. I went to the Institute of Physics in London and Bristol as editorial director, running 37 physics research journals. And that's where I really learned something about publishing and how research is dealt with at the very highest level, so that we select hopefully the best quality possible. But then very quickly through the rest, 2 or 3 years in Northern Ireland, leading nanotechnology for that region at a time when the DTI, Department of Trade and Industry, as it then was in Britain, was very much interested in industrial regeneration of that terribly war-torn region. How do you get employment going again? How do you regenerate in engineering and start to build jobs and community there? And Queen's University Belfast was a wonderful place, along with the University of Ulster, to have as a base to do that, and with such very powerful people in Northern Ireland, like Seagate, just outside Londonderry. So we had some great collaborations there and great opportunities to develop nano optics, nanophotonics, and applications which might lead to industrial regeneration.
If I might interject there, whilst we're on the subject of nanotechnology, I have a question from the Professor J.D. Prabhu,
Sure.
the Nehru professor at Judge Business School. He says, "Dear Robert, I would be very interested to know what implications nanotechnology might have for developing affordable solutions for low-income communities in places like India and Africa, for instance, in developing water filters, lighting and cooking solutions, dealing with pollution, etc. Your thoughts would be much appreciated."
Okay, well, I'm not an expert in many of those topics, but I point to challenges. In nanotechnology, we certainly saw this in Ireland. A lot of the nanotechnology that we've been pursuing these last 20 or 30 years is related to and requires a lot of high capital expenditure on very specialist equipment operating down at the nanometers and few nanometers scale. And there are a lot of countries around that really cannot afford to go that route at all. So we can do some wonderful research, certainly in the wealthier Western countries, using very expensive equipment, and we're lucky to be funded by our national agencies to be able to develop clusters of such instrumentation to allow us to do some very fine and very fundamental both science and technology developments. But that's not good enough for the developing world, where they just don't have the investment or the infrastructure to support that. And I sort of recognise that to some extent in Northern Ireland, that we had a very limited budget for our work, but we also wanted to create industrial outputs for nanotechnology. And so some of the work that came out of there was nanomagnetics, which ended up in Seagate drives, hard drives. Some of the work was as simple as nanoparticulates, which were applied to clothing to stop smells developing, basically, as biological inhibitors. Sometimes you have to think way away from these big, highfalutin experiments and pieces of equipment. The two areas that immediately ring out in my mind are, firstly, really nanotechnology has been around forever. It's actually what chemists have been doing for decades, if not 100 years or more. So there's an enormous amount of chemistry which is naturally just nanotechnology, forming colloidal suspensions by mixing chemicals, liquids together, and just letting nanoparticles naturally fall out of chemical reactions is a way of generating beautiful nanoparticle situations for whatever the application. And then sometimes you don't want to have to do lithography and then all the post-processing that we do in clean rooms to create nanostructures and nanosamples. There are many people, particularly in the UK actually, in leading universities, who have been pursuing self-assembly technologies and techniques. People have been using DNA structures, 3D scaffolds, and other scaffolds where you can, just through natural processes, allow nanoparticles to take up certain shapes and forms and structures because you supply them with an underlying template. This is really inexpensive technology, and it's the sort of technology that, frankly, you could do it probably in the poorest country on the planet. And may actually allow them to keep up with everybody and maybe even leapfrog us, because we're so intent in Western institutes in doing so much of the work is very expensive. And sometimes we really miss the simple solutions. I do wonder from time to time if we are actually pursuing aggressively enough the lower cost solutions and the self-assembly solutions. I think that's an area which I would like to see much more investment and research and development of in the future. I think that will get us into industrial scale-up activities and new business opportunities much faster than trying to develop a lot of today's technology, which is very difficult to scale, and supremely expensive to scale as well.
Could you tell us a little bit about your work within health? For example, your current work through the Beckman Institute, I believe, is in the area of 3D endoscopes. Could you talk about that?
Absolutely. My colleagues, I came from Belfast directly to California. And I was very fortunate soon after I arrived in California to become associated with the Beckman Laser Institute and the medical clinic at the University of California in Irvine, which was very close to my home there. and to meet with Bruce Tromberg, who is an outstanding director of that institute, who's been really the inspiration for that institute for decades at this point in time. His research is, and indeed the team's research, is very much focused on the use of laser techniques and light scattering techniques, diffuse optical spectroscopic techniques, to look inside breast material, and perhaps one day in the future, perhaps even brain material, to detect tumours, cancerous tumours, and to try and identify those, to be able to detect them very early and to be able to localize exactly where they are, for example, inside a breast, so that one can develop strategies for dealing with them, maybe catch them much earlier than we can catch them with mammography, yet to be fully proven. But nevertheless, the aim there is to try and create much more competent diagnostic techniques than we have at the present time, to find these cancers and then to be able to, maybe, I'm going to speculate now, why not use three-dimensional imaging inside a breast to drive a 3D robotic surgical tool, which might be able to do lumpectomy rather than complete mastectomy at a very early stage, or some other process or procedure. I'm not going to speculate wildly because it always raises a lot of over-expectation in people, and I don't want to disappoint people. But this is ongoing research. It's in clinical trials phase at the present time. I think there's plenty of data being acquired, and it will be fascinating, frankly fascinating, to see where optics and photonics can lead us in terms of medical clinical detections. Now let's turn to the 3D endoscope. Mm-hmm. There are already in the marketplace some 3D endoscopes based on fiber optics and such like, but they're very limited capability. And what we would like to do is extend both the 3D endoscopic process itself, so that as we push an endoscope through your GI tract or somewhere else in your body, we see not only just the forward look, but maybe the sideways look and the backward look, and we can build maybe a complete surround 3D image of what's going on inside you through an endoscopic probe. That's the kind of thing we can't do at the present time, but it's a lovely potential combination of photonics and imaging technologies, and then very big data processing to be able to create surround 3D that maybe a surgeon can get inside and be able to see what is going on and feel what it's like to be inside you, looking at maybe a polyp in your intestine or some other problem with another organ like a kidney or a liver or maybe prostate or whatever. This is extremely early days, and that's highly speculative. And all we really want to do, and all we've really achieved so far, is to work out techniques by which we can put some of these optics deep inside you through endoscopic probes and combine them with 3D imaging information, so that we make it much easier for the surgeon to be able to work in 3D instead of 2D off a flat screen. And also to be able to transmit diagnostic information back to whoever is looking deep inside you. We've got a long way to go yet. I think our major contribution at this point in time has been to be able to quantify very precisely what is going on in the three-dimensional space inside you that we're looking at. So we can measure the shape of the polyp, perhaps, at this point in time. We can possibly diagnose whether it's malignant or benign or just a cyst of some kind. And also, we can go in at a later time, maybe in a week's time or a month's time, and measure it again and see whether it's grown or see whether it's shrunk. We have the possibility of doing in-situ surgery much more precisely. So we're trying to open up possibilities by quantifying the three-dimensional space and then bringing other techniques in, such as diagnostic techniques or perhaps eradication techniques or whatever. An ongoing program very much in its early stages, but really pointing to novel uses of photonics for the benefit of people, for the benefit of anybody anywhere on this planet, maybe one day.
I have a final question from Geeta Peterson, who is the founder of Genomic Expression. And to a very large degree, you have answered this question already. But just in case you have anything further to add, I will read out her question. My question to Dr. Brown is more on his vision for future applications of laser light technology in health, and more specifically in genetics. Maybe we haven't answered the genetic side of the question.
So I'm not going to even pretend that I'm an expert in genetics, but there is some distinct opportunity, it would seem, from these early days of research and experimentation in optogenetics, where there's chemical modification and sensitization of, for example, neurons to laser light. And maybe we can control the flow of information, or maybe we can use this for diagnostic tools. Maybe we could even use it for some sort of cures. I know that there's a large body of people out there doing research in this area, and frankly, I'm not the right person to ask about this. But I'm acutely aware that there is real potential, real promise, and it's an area where there's a lot of new investment going. And I would say watch this space. I think it's extremely early days. It would be wrong to overly speculate about where we might get to. But this idea of marrying laser light to human flesh, skin and bone, is what we're doing in Irvine and many other research centres around the world. And this is yet another wonderful development which does seem to have a great deal of promise, and people are getting pretty excited about the early results. So I would say watch this space and listen to the other experts perhaps tell you about the real opportunities, but certainly something we should be getting excited about, and I'm clear in my own mind it's an area that we should be investing a lot of attention and probably quite a lot of research dollars at this time.
You've been a professor, as we said earlier, for over 20 years. What type of teacher are you?
Oh, goodness. I know that my ratings are okay. In other words, the student feedback has generally been pretty positive. I try to be a very a leader and a teacher in a very hands-on way. I really like to sit down one-on-one with students and colleagues. I like to lecture in a very informal way, and I like to lecture really almost as a conversation rather than as a formal lecture. I like to talk about experiments that we've done and why we went about them and how we went about them and what the challenges and the problems were and how we set about overcoming some of those to get the results that one day we got after a lot of hard work and many missteps on the route. We make lots and lots of mistakes. We don't give up and we keep going, and eventually, finally, you get the result you deserve for your labours. So I try to teach by example. I try to teach in a friendly, conversational way. I do spend a lot of time planning and preparing materials, as I think everybody does who takes their responsibilities seriously. But I try and do it in a as informal way and using the latest technologies, because that's really what everyone's trying to use at this point in time. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's,
yes, it does. Yes, it does. Thank you very much. You mentioned right at the beginning of this interview that there was a sort of an inspirational spark that happened when you were 3 years old that started your journey into photonics, research, physics. I was wondering if you had a favourite teacher who encouraged that interest early on.
And I've never really talked about it to anyone except, I think, my wife. And that is that at high school, I went to the Wakeman School in Shrewsbury in Shropshire. And there was an inspirational physics teacher there whose name was Beryl Lloyd. And she was a very young and dynamic physics and chemistry teacher.
And how fascinating that it was a woman.
Yes, absolutely. And she was immensely helpful and supportive to me. I felt at times that I was getting absolutely 100% one-on-one tuition from her, even though she had a huge class. She took her responsibilities very seriously, and I think she was a model teacher. She was somebody who really persuaded me that physics was my future profession.
Were you good at all subjects at school, or did you have a particular interest in science and physics?
I had a particular interest in science, physics, and music. I became a flute player at a very early age, and I still play to this day, and I had a wonderful time through my 20s, 30s, and 40s, playing with many different orchestras and ensembles and in different parts of the world. I'm no longer performing professionally because, frankly, my job these days is just too big to allow for the practice time to maintain the standards that you really want to maintain in yourself to be able to walk onto a stage and really give your best possible performances. The route to physics was not simple. I was very, very poor at mathematics until I was about 14 or 15.
My goodness, that's hard to believe.
Yes, yeah, I know, but here's how things changed. I had the good fortune to get glandular fever. I was laid up in bed for some weeks ill. I couldn't go to school. My math master lived across the road from me, and he came over and he tutored me every night for the weeks that I spent in bed recovering from glandular fever. And one-on-one tuition from a dedicated teacher of math took me from being, frankly, the bottom of the class to going, the big aha moment. I finally understood what the heck all this symbology and stuff was all about, and I understood the concepts. And he drilled the concept into me over those sort of 1 or 2 months, to the point where I've never looked back. I've never had a problem dealing with the math, and the math is so fundamental to everything we do in physics. If you can't do the math, you're going to struggle forever. Because I could do the math, then the physics became so much easier. And to this day, that was probably the best thing that ever happened to me, was falling ill for a few weeks.
Do you have siblings?
I have a sister who has had a wonderful career through the Royal Air Force, and she now lives in Uxbridge with her husband, who is also in the Royal Air Force. And they have just returned from the United States. They've been at Oceania Air Force Base in Virginia Beach. So I've been very lucky to have my sister quite close by for a while. And then I have 2 sons who are both scientists and engineers, and 3 grandchildren. And who knows what they will turn out.
And what about your parents?
My father was very interested in technology, particularly interested again in optics. He was a photographer in his spare time. He did a lot of photography during the Second World War in some of the camps in Germany, for example, which I think was a fairly grueling exercise for him. I saw a lot of his photographs. They were quite horrific. And so he had this, and we often talked about photography and optics. My mother was a very loving and very caring person, and worked a lot with the Red Cross and with other agencies. Wherever she could work to help other people, she was always there. And so between them, I had a great deal of support. She was tremendously helpful. And my father really helped lead me forward into technology. Certainly a great deal of encouragement from him. He was very fond of cars and taking them to bits and mending them and putting them back together, and bicycles and photography. And so these sort of technical and engineering type activities were always there and being done around the family. And
what about mentors? Have you ever been mentored?
Yes, and I still to this day have a mentor. I think it's vitally important. As a young scientist, I tried to meet the great and the good. I realized early on that if you want to be the best, and I've always had that aspiration, try and be as good as possible and work absolutely at the frontiers and the next most impossible problem, or the next thing that we don't really understand. I've always wanted to work there. I was extremely fortunate very early in my career to go to the radar establishment in Malvern and meet Roy Pike, who is an emeritus professor at King's College to this day. And we've stayed in touch these last 40 years. I haven't worked with him now for more than 20 years. But we still routinely contact each other. And I would say that his leadership, his guidance, his mentoring, particularly through my times in Malvern and then in Oxford for Sharp Labs and 1 or 2 other places, and his making available opportunities for me to go and try things and see other sides of science and technology. His mentorship was absolutely fundamental to everything I've done. And I freely acknowledge that I could not have done a tiny fraction of what I've done today to this time without Roy Pike's incredible interest and backing and support and guidance and deep teaching over the years.
And how did that come about? How did it come about, that moment when he offered to be your mentor, or maybe you dropped a few hints? How did it all come about?
So I was working at a company which is now called Malvern Instruments, and I was a young research development engineer, development physicist, I think I was called, which is it's a funny title. And we were working on a contract for the Royal Radar establishment next door, the government's Central Electronics Research Facility next door. We were working on a contract to build a fast correlator to go and measure these statistical properties of photons that I talked about at the opening of the interview. And Pike would come and visit us, of course, routinely to make sure that we were doing the right things and producing the results that he and his research team over the other side of the wire in the Government Research Centre wanted to be able to use. And I had the great pleasure of just meeting him and talking to him informally. And I think I dropped a hint, but I wasn't particularly happy doing what I was doing. But I loved the work I was doing, but I wasn't particularly happy in the organisation that I was in for all sorts of reasons. And he invited me to interview. He said, would you like to join the team? And I was, 21, 22, 23, something like that. Very green. certainly lacking in confidence in those days. I've grown a little confidence since then. And Pike brought me into the radar establishment. I was interviewed by many of his team, and I was singularly fortunate. I think it was probably the best piece of fortune, apart from my physics teacher in my teens, the best piece of fortune I'd had in my career, that I was given this incredible privilege, the incredible opportunity to go and work with the finest in Britain in quantum optics and photonics and lasers at that time in the early to mid-1970s. And that set me up for a lifetime. So yes, it came about sort of by accident, but slightly engineered.
Do you have a mentee?
I have one or two students. I've had one in particular at the University of California in Irvine, who's just graduated with his master's degree. I'm absolutely thrilled for him. And we've had an awful lot of fun developing some of the 3D endoscopic technology I was just talking about. In my current employment as chief executive of the American Institute, I think my colleagues wouldn't mind me saying that I do from time to time do a little bit of mentoring, a little bit of sort of, so how are we going to deal with this, and working things out one-on-one with them. I wouldn't call it mentoring, but I think it's oblique mentoring.
You mentioned earlier that you are endlessly curious. Is there a big idea that you would jump at the opportunity of working on if somebody gave you the opportunity?
Yes, I would very much like to get into the ways that we can use the laser technology that we've developed over these decades. And now we've had 30 or 40 years of developing these single photon counting and single photon correlation techniques. And now we're starting to apply them in biomedicine for breast cancer research and development. I would love to be able to have the money and the time and the team around me to be able to move those techniques and those technologies into even more remote areas and more inaccessible areas of the body. I think I would love to see all this work migrate to measurements inside the human brain. I would like to be able to measure brain function better. I'd love to be able to use these techniques to identify brain cancers and other problems within the brain. But the problem which stops at the moment is this shell, this skull that we have, which doesn't allow laser light to penetrate unless it's really quite a long wavelength. So there are some real technical challenges. There's some supremely difficult medical challenges as well. I would like to go into the brain, but I would also like to develop some of these technologies for liver cancer and kidney cancer and pancreatic cancer, and there are, I think those are much easier problems to solve than the brain problem. But the big idea would be, how can we take these laser techniques and really get into how the brain is operating and where the problems are, and identifying them and fixing them. That may take decades of work with serious investment, but that's a sort of big long-term dream. How
would you attract investment into something like that? Would it be government investment, or would it be a combination of institutes, universities, governments all coming in together?
Yes, I've found through my entire career that showing a few early experimental results tends to bring on the funding very much more quickly than talking about it. And so I'd be looking for some seed corn money to try some very simple experiments using the existing technologies on certain well-identified problems. Maybe just simple detection of a particular type of cancer growing in a brain. Could we do it in an area where we can have more easy access? So the skull is quite thin in some places, and maybe we can do some research about the very thin areas to see if we can get some early data to give the confidence and the encouragement. The science foundations, such as they are, find it quite difficult. They say that they fund a lot of interdisciplinary research internally. They find it quite difficult to kind of interdisciplinary research funding, because how do you judge the physics, and how do you judge the engineering, how do you judge the medical side of things and the biological side of things, and how do you put together the team that can actually make sense of all this and decide whether the funding and the directions of research are appropriate. So I would certainly go to the funding agencies. NSF would be a good place to start. I'd also go to the military, because they're very interested in brain function for soldiers. And so places like DARPA are very interested in the brain. In fact, they have a brain program here in the United States, which is really getting underway at this point in time. But I would also go to foundations. One of the things that I've learned in recent years is that there are many medical foundations and scientific foundations around the world which actually are very well heeled. There's plenty of money in foundations for really absolute frontier stuff, which is going to make a huge difference to people in the future. So I would definitely look for foundation support as well. I'm not going to speculate which foundations would want to support that, but I think actually if I started looking seriously, I'd probably find some fairly quickly.
As CEO of the American Institute of Physics, and also as your role as professor at California University, no doubt you meet large numbers of extremely interesting people.
Yes.
But is there somebody that you haven't met to date that you would like to meet? It can be either within your field of research, your field of work, or within your field of interests, maybe music.
Yes.
And if there is somebody, what would you like to ask them?
Yes, I do have people I would love to meet. In this position and in other positions, I've been singularly privileged and very fortunate to meet a lot of Nobel Prize winners because that's the nature of this job. It's not because I'm doing anything special. That is part of this job, that you meet the great and the good from all over. Sometimes Kavli Prize winners. I get invited to an awful lot of very high-profile events with big names, and I have met pretty much everybody in certainly the physics areas that I'm particularly interested in, that I've always wanted to meet. So I'm going to choose a musician, because music is the other side of my life, and we haven't talked much about that. To me, as somebody who's excited me since the first time I heard her a few years ago, live in concert, I think one of the greatest living pianists today is a Chinese lady by the name of Yuja Wang. I'm a huge fan of hers. I've been to many of her live concerts here in the United States. She is the most sassy, dynamic, bubbly, laughing, and pianist that I've ever seen. She dresses unbelievably in terms of, she really challenges her audience in terms of what you should wear as a dress to do a concert recital, piano music or playing with an orchestra or whatever. But she has this effervescence, this bubbly nature, and here she is, late 20s, early 30s, I'm not quite sure how old she is, but she's achieved a level of technical and musical perfection which I've only heard once or twice in the last 50 years or more. I think she could become one of the greatest living pianists ever, and she may already be there. I would love to meet her and talk about how and why she's been in music, and how she's at such a young age managed to rise to such an incredible degree of musical perfection, because my own interests and my own challenges in music have been actually quite tough, and I want to know how she actually achieved it, and what has motivated and pushed her, and what continues to motivate and push her on what, concert pianists lead incredibly peripatetic lives. They're ever living in planes and hotels, and have actually, to some extent, quite a lonely existence. I'd like to know how she copes with all that and maintains her remarkable presence and positive spirit in nature.
Dr. Robert Brown, creator, human, and CEO of the American Institute of Physics, thank you so much for your time.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun.